Welcome to Crypt Liturgy. Before we begin this powerful true story, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video and stay with us until the very end, because this story will shake you and teach you something history tried to hide. Now let us step into the cotton fields of Georgia in the year 1836, where grief became fury, where a 16-year-old boy who had lost everything that made life worth living decided that if he could not save the people he loved, then he would at least make the place that destroyed them burn, where patience and planning met desperation and rage, and where one night in September the sky over Wilkinson County turned orange with flames that consumed not just buildings and cotton, but the illusion that enslaved people would forever accept their bondage without making their oppressors pay a price that could be calculated in ash and ruin and economic devastation. The state of Georgia in 1836 was at the peak of its cotton prosperity. The invention of the cotton gin 4 decades earlier had transformed the deep South into an economic powerhouse that supplied raw material to textile mills in New England, and that generated enormous wealth for the planter class who controlled the land and the labor. Georgia's cotton production had increased every year since 1800. By 1836, the state was producing over 100,000 bales annually, with each bale representing 400 pounds of cotton fiber, picked and processed by enslaved hands working from dawn until darkness in fields that stretched across the Piedmont and into the coastal plains. The wealth this system generated was staggering. Major plantation owners in Georgia were among the richest men in America. They built mansions that rivaled anything in the North. They sent their sons to universities and their daughters to finishing schools. They lived lives of leisure and refinement supported entirely by the forced labor of human beings they owned as property. But that wealth came with a cost that the planters themselves rarely calculated or acknowledged. The cost in human suffering. The cost in families torn apart by sales and separations. The cost in bodies broken by labor. It was designed to extract maximum profit before those bodies wore out and needed to be replaced. And the cost in the rage that accumulated in the hearts of people who were treated as things rather than as human beings. Rage that most learned to suppress because expressing it meant death, but that some, when pushed far enough, when they had lost enough, could no longer contain. This is a story about one of those people. A boy who became a weapon. A child who became an instrument of destruction. So complete that the plantation that had killed his family ceased to exist, and the man who had profited from their deaths lost everything he had built. His name was recorded in plantation ledgers as Samuel, property of Colonel William Ashford, born 1820, valued at $600. But the ledgers told nothing about who Samuel actually was. They did not record that his mother was named Dinah, a woman who had been born free in Maryland and who had been kidnapped at age 12 by slave traders who forged papers saying she was escaped property, who had been sold south and who had spent the rest of her life in bondage, knowing that somewhere in Maryland her parents had no idea what had become of her. They did not record that Samuel's father was a man named Joseph, who worked as a carpenter on the plantation, who had taught Samuel everything he knew about working with wood and tools, who had survived slavery by focusing on his craft and by maintaining a careful neutrality that kept him from drawing the dangerous attention of overseers. They did not record that Samuel had 2 younger sisters, Grace, who was 13, and Patience, who was 11. Both of them field workers, despite their young ages, because Colonel Ashford believed that children should begin contributing to plantation profits as early as possible. The Ashford plantation, called Riverbend, was located in Wilkinson County, Georgia, approximately 100 miles south of Atlanta, in country that was still being cleared and developed in 1836. Ashford had purchased the land in 1825, using inherited money from his father's merchant business in Savannah. He had started with 400 acres and 30 enslaved people. By 1836, he had expanded to over 2,000 acres, worked by 110 enslaved people producing cotton that was shipped down the Oconee River to the coast, and from there to markets in the north and overseas. Ashford was 48 years old in 1836, married with 4 children of his own, a man who considered himself a progressive planter who treated his human property better than most, who rarely used the whip himself, preferring to leave such unpleasantness to his overseer, who sometimes expressed to his wife the opinion that slavery was a difficult institution, but one that was economically necessary, and that would perhaps be reformed in some distant future when alternative labor systems became practical. What? Ashford's self-image as a benevolent master. Concealed was the reality that Riverbend Plantation functioned exactly like every other cotton plantation in Georgia, through violence and the threat of violence, through the systematic denial of enslaved people's humanity, through the extraction of maximum labor for minimum cost, and through the willingness to destroy families and bodies and lives in pursuit of profit. The overseer who managed the daily operations was a man named Silas Crawford, 35 years old, originally from North Carolina, where he had worked on tobacco farms before moving south to take advantage of the higher wages that cotton overseers could command. Crawford was known as a hard driver who believed that enslaved people needed to be kept constantly at work and constantly afraid in order to produce the yields that planters expected. He carried a whip. He used it regularly, and he had the authority from Ashford to punish anyone who, in his judgment, was not working hard enough, or who showed any sign of what he called insolence. Samuel had grown up at Riverbend. He had been born there in the slave quarters, had spent his childhood watching his parents work themselves, exhausted day after day, had learned early that the world was divided into people who owned and people who were owned, and that he belonged to the second category, with no prospect of ever crossing into the first. But Samuel's childhood had not been entirely without light. His father Joseph's skills as a carpenter meant that the family had slightly better conditions than field workers. A small cabin rather than shared quarters, occasional extra food when Joseph was given provisions for completing special projects, and most importantly, the relative stability of not being separated because skilled workers like Joseph were valuable enough that planters tried to keep them content within the narrow margins that contentment was possible under slavery. Samuel learned his father's trade starting at age 7. Joseph taught him how to measure and cut wood, how to joint boards together, how to use the various tools that a carpenter needed, the saws and planes and chisels and hammers that transformed rough lumber into finished structures. By the time Samuel was 12, he was skilled enough to work alongside his father on most projects. They repaired buildings, constructed new slave quarters as the plantation population grew, built furniture for the main house, and crafted all the wooden implements that plantation agriculture required, from wagon wheels to tool handles. This work was hard, but it was not the killing labor of the cotton fields. It required skill rather than just endurance, and it created between father and son a bond that went beyond the usual parent-child relationship. They were partners in craft. They spoke through the work they did together. They found in the precise fitting of wood joints a kind of order and beauty that the rest of their enslaved existence denied them. Dinah and the 2 girls worked in the fields. They joined the work gangs at dawn and labored until darkness in the pattern that defined field work on cotton plantations. Planting in spring, chopping weeds through summer, Picking cotton during the fall harvest season that stretched from August until January, depending on when the crop matured. The work was relentless. The quotas were designed to be barely achievable, even for the strongest adults, which meant that children and elderly and anyone, weakened by illness or injury, struggled constantly to meet the demands placed upon them. Dinah had been in the fields for 24 years by 1836. She was 36 years old and looked 50. Her hands were gnarled from handling cotton plants, whose sharp edges cut the skin. Her back was bent from the constant stooping that picking required. Her health had been declining for several years. The accumulated damage of decades of extreme labor catching up with her in ways that became more obvious each season. The summer of 1836 was particularly brutal in Georgia. Temperatures reached over 100 degrees for weeks at a time. The humidity was suffocating. Working in the fields during these conditions was dangerous even for healthy people. For someone like Dinah, whose body was already compromised, it was potentially lethal. Silas Crawford knew this. He saw that Dinah was struggling. But Crawford operated according to the economic logic that governed plantation management, which was that enslaved people were investments that needed to produce returns, and that allowing someone to work at reduced capacity because they were unwell set a bad precedent that would encourage others to claim illness to avoid full labor. So when Dinah began showing signs of heat exhaustion in mid-July, when she started moving slower and struggling to meet her daily quota, Crawford's response was not to reduce her workload, but to push her harder, to use the whip to drive her to continue working despite her body's clear signals that it was shutting down. Samuel learned what was happening to his mother from Grace and Patience, who came home each evening with stories about how Dinah was being treated, about how Crawford was forcing her to continue working in the midday heat when even the strongest workers were struggling, about how she was staggering and falling and being whipped back to her feet. Samuel went to his father with this information, expecting that Joseph would intervene somehow, would appeal to Crawford or to Ashford, would use whatever small leverage he possessed as a skilled worker to get help for his wife. But Joseph's response was not what Samuel expected. Joseph told him that there was nothing to be done, that intervening would only make things worse, that Crawford's authority was absolute, and that challenging it would result in punishment that would help no one, that the only path to survival was to endure and to hope that the situation would improve on its own. Samuel did not accept this answer. At 16, he had not yet learned the careful calculations of survival that his father had mastered. He had not yet internalized the lesson that resistance within the system was futile, and that the only real options were acceptance or escape or death. He went to Crawford himself, approached the overseer one evening after work, and asked respectfully if his mother could be given lighter duties until she recovered her strength. Crawford's response was immediate and violent. He struck Samuel across the face with the back of his hand hard enough to knock the boy to the ground. He told Samuel that slaves did not question overseers' decisions, that Samuel's mother would work at full capacity, or she would be whipped until she did, and that if Samuel ever approached him again with such impertinence, he would be sold south to the rice plantations, where boys with attitudes learned very quickly to keep their mouths shut. Samuel retreated, but the rage inside him did not diminish. It grew. He watched his mother declining day by day. He watched Crawford driving her without mercy. He watched his father doing nothing, paralyzed by the same calculations of powerlessness that kept most enslaved people from acting even when action was desperately needed. And Samuel began to understand something that would shape everything that followed. He understood that the system of slavery functioned not just through physical force, but through the psychological acceptance of powerlessness by the enslaved. that most people survived by convincing themselves that there was no alternative to acceptance, that fighting back was impossible or too dangerous or too likely to make things worse. But Samuel also understood that this acceptance was a choice, that powerlessness was at least partially self-imposed, and that someone who rejected the acceptance and who was willing to pay any price could do things that the system assumed were impossible. On August 3, 1836, Dinah collapsed in the cotton field. The temperature that day reached 104 degrees. She had been working since dawn. She had been whipped twice that morning for moving too slowly. Her body simply gave out. She fell between the rows of cotton and did not get up. Grace and Patience ran to her, tried to revive her, screamed for help. Other workers gathered around. Someone ran to get Crawford. By the time the overseer arrived, Dinah was unconscious. Crawford ordered 2 men to carry her to the slave quarters and then told everyone else to get back to work because there was a quota to meet, and standing around was not going to pick cotton. Dinah died that evening without regaining consciousness. The plantation doctor, who was summoned more out of concern for the potential loss of property than out of any care for Dinah as a person, concluded that she had died from heat exhaustion and dehydration, that her heart had simply stopped working after being pushed beyond its capacity. He recorded the death in his medical log as a natural death. He noted that the enslaved woman had been in declining health for some time. He made no mention of Crawford's role in working her to death. Such details were not relevant to the economic calculation that mattered, which was that Colonel Ashford had lost an asset worth approximately $400 and would need to purchase a replacement when opportunities arose. Samuel and his sisters were allowed to bury their mother the following day in the area beyond the slave quarters where enslaved people who died at Riverbend were interred in unmarked graves. Joseph built a simple coffin, working through the night with tears running down his face, the only time Samuel ever saw his father cry. The funeral was brief. A few words spoken by one of the elderly enslaved people who served as an informal preacher for the community. A prayer asking God to receive Dinah's spirit and to grant her in death the peace and freedom she had been denied in life. And then the coffin was lowered into Georgia soil and covered over. One more unmarked grave in a growing field of them. Physical evidence of the human cost of cotton that no ledger recorded and no plantation owner acknowledged. Something broke in Samuel when he watched his mother's coffin disappear into the ground. Or perhaps something that had been merely cracked finally shattered completely. He stood at that graveside and understood with absolute clarity that Dinah's death was not natural and was not unavoidable. She had been murdered, not with a knife or a gun, but with a whip and with the economic logic that said her body was worth using until it was used up. Crawford had murdered her. Ashford had murdered her by creating the system that empowered Crawford. And every white person in Georgia who benefited from cotton picked by enslaved hands bore some portion of responsibility for her death and for the deaths of thousands like her who worked themselves to death in these fields. The rage that filled Samuel in that moment was beyond anything he had experienced before. It was not the hot rage of immediate anger that flares and fades. It was cold rage, calculating rage, the kind of rage that does not dissipate but crystallizes into determination, that transforms grief into purpose and pain into planning. Samuel stood at his mother's grave and made a decision. He could not bring her back. He could not save her. But he could make the people responsible for her death pay. He could hurt them in ways that mattered to them. He could take from them something they valued the way they had taken from him someone he valued. And he knew exactly what that was. Their wealth, their property, their precious cotton, and the buildings and machinery that allowed them to extract profit from enslaved labor. If he could not give his mother justice, he could at least give her revenge. The plan formed in Samuel's mind over the following weeks. It would have to wait until harvest time, when the cotton had been picked and was stored in the gin house waiting to be processed. That would be the moment of maximum value and maximum vulnerability, when a year's worth of labor and profit sat in buildings that were fundamentally just large wooden structures filled with highly flammable plant material. Fire was the obvious method. Fire was something Samuel understood well from years of working with his father, who needed fire for various aspects of woodworking, who had taught Samuel how fire behaved and how to control it and how to make it burn hot or slow, depending on what the work required. And fire was democratic. It did not require strength or weapons or allies. One person with determination and some basic materials could create a fire that would consume everything it touched, but Samuel knew he could not act immediately. He needed to wait for the right moment. He needed to avoid drawing suspicion, and he needed to make preparations that would maximize the damage while minimizing the chance of being caught before the fire could spread beyond the point of control. He spent August and September in a state of barely controlled tension, going through the motions of normal work while his mind constantly worked on the details of his plan. He observed the patterns of the night patrols that overseers conducted. He noted which buildings were closest to each other and how fire might spread from one to another. He identified where flammable materials were stored, where the cotton was kept, where the gin machinery stood that represented significant capital investment. And he waited for the optimal moment. That moment came in mid-September, when the first major harvest of cotton was completed, and the gin house was full of picked cotton waiting to be processed. The gin house at Riverbend was a large wooden structure, approximately 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, built to house the cotton gin machinery and to store both raw cotton waiting to be processed and processed cotton waiting to be baled and shipped. On the night of September 18, 1836, the gin house contained approximately 40,000 pounds of picket cotton, representing the labor of 110 enslaved people working for 2 months, representing value of over $4,000, which was enough to make or break the plantation's finances for the year. Next to the gin house stood the equipment shed, where tools and spare parts were stored. Beyond that was the carpenter shop, where Samuel and his father worked. And beyond that were the slave quarters and the main house. The spatial arrangement of Riverbend's buildings was typical of Georgia plantations. The work buildings were clustered together for efficiency. The slave quarters were positioned close enough to the work areas that enslaved people did not waste time traveling but far enough from the main house that the planter family did not have to observe the realities of how the people they owned actually lived. The main house itself stood at some distance, elevated both physically and symbolically above the work areas, positioned to have good views of the plantation grounds, but insulated from the sights and smells of the actual production that funded its elegance. This arrangement meant that a fire starting in the gin house would likely spread to other work buildings before anyone in the main house even noticed. On the evening of September 18th, Samuel told his father he needed to finish some work in the carpenter shop, a task that had to be completed for the next day. This was not unusual. Joseph sometimes allowed Samuel to work after hours on projects that had deadlines. Joseph himself was tired and went to bed in their cabin. Samuel went to the carpenter shop, as he had said, but the work he did, there was not what he had told his father. He gathered materials he would need: pieces of oil-soaked cloth that would burn easily, wood shavings and sawdust that would catch fire quickly, several bottles of turpentine that was kept in the shop for cleaning tools and finishing wood. These materials were common in any carpenter's shop. Their presence would not be suspicious. But Samuel was going to use them for a purpose their makers had never intended. He waited until well after midnight, when the plantation was as quiet as it ever got. The patrols had been reduced in recent weeks, as harvest work exhausted everyone, including the overseers. Samuel moved through the darkness toward the gin house with his materials concealed in a canvas bag. He moved carefully, using the paths and shadows he knew from 16 years of living at Riverbend, avoiding the areas where he might be seen. The gin house was locked, but Samuel knew where a loose board allowed access to the building's interior. He had discovered this weakness months earlier and had said nothing about it, storing the information away as something that might be useful. Someday, not knowing exactly how, but trusting his instinct that knowledge was power, and that the more you knew about the plantation's vulnerabilities, the better prepared you would be if opportunity arose. Samuel slipped inside the gin house through the loose board. The interior was dark and filled with the smell of raw cotton and machine oil. He could feel the presence of all that cotton, even though he could barely see it, bales and piles of it stacked throughout the building, waiting to be processed. This cotton represented everything the plantation existed to produce. It was the reason Samuel and his family had been enslaved. It was the reason his mother had been worked to death. It was the reason Colonel Ashford lived in comfort while people suffered to enrich him. And Samuel was about to turn all of it into ashdot. He worked quickly and methodically, placing the oil-soaked cloth in strategic locations around the building, creating multiple ignition points that would ensure the fire spread quickly and would make it impossible to extinguish once started. He poured turpentine onto piles of cotton, the volatile liquid soaking into the fibers. He created pathways of wood shavings and sawdust that would carry fire from one ignition point to another. And then, when everything was prepared, he used the flint and steel that every plantation had for starting fires, and he lit the first cloth. The flame caught immediately. It spread to the sawdust pathway. Within seconds, multiple spots in the gin house were burning. Within a minute, the fire was already beyond what one person could have fought. Even if water had been immediately available, Samuel did not stay to watch. He slipped out through the loose board and moved quickly back toward the slave quarters, taking a different route than he had used to approach, making sure he would be seen coming from the direction of his cabin rather than from the direction of the gin house. He had been gone perhaps 30 minutes total. His father was still sleeping. Samuel lay down on his own bed and waited for what he knew would come soon. He waited with his heart pounding and with something that felt like satisfaction mixed with terror. He had done it. He had struck back. He had hurt them. Now he would see what consequences followed. The fire was discovered perhaps 10 minutes after Samuel returned to his cabin. Someone walking between buildings saw the glow and raised the alarm. Within minutes, the plantation was in chaos. Bells ringing, people shouting, everyone running toward the gin house with buckets and tools, trying to fight a fire that was already far beyond fighting. By the time Colonel Ashford emerged from the main house, woken by the commotion, the gin house was fully engulfed. The flames had spread to the equipment shed. The heat was intense enough that it was dangerous to approach within 50 feet of the buildings, and the cotton inside the gin house was burning with a fierce intensity that sent sparks and flaming debris high into the night air, debris that landed on other buildings and started secondary fires faster than they could be contained. The enslaved population was ordered to form bucket lines from the nearest well, passing water hand to hand to be thrown onto the flames in a futile effort to control the blaze. Samuel joined these lines like everyone else, working alongside people who had no idea that he was responsible for what they were trying to fight, working with a combination of genuine effort to help his community and a secret satisfaction at seeing the plantation's most valuable assets burning. The bucket lines were useless. The fire was too large, had too much fuel, had started from too many points to be contained with the limited water supply and primitive. Firefighting methods available in rural Georgia in 1836. All anyone could do was watch it burn and tried to prevent it from spreading to the slave quarters and the main house. Gin house burned completely. The equipment shed burned completely. The carpenter's shop caught fire and was partially destroyed before enough water could be brought to save part of the structure. By dawn the fire had burned itself out, leaving smoking ruins and a scene of devastation that represented the complete destruction of Riverbend's cotton processing capability and the loss of the entire first harvest. The financial damage was enormous. The 40,000 pounds of cotton alone represented over $4,000 in lost revenue. The gin house and equipment represented another $2,000 in construction and machinery costs. The tools and materials in the destroyed buildings added hundreds more. And beyond the immediate financial loss, there was the operational disruption. Without a gin house, Riverbend could not process cotton. Without processing capability, the plantation could not generate revenue. Colonel Ashford would have to rebuild the gin house before the next harvest, would have to purchase replacement equipment, would likely have to take loans to cover these costs, since the destroyed cotton had been the expected source of funds for operating expenses. The investigation began immediately. Ashford brought in the county sheriff. They examined the remains of the gin house, looking for evidence of how the fire had started. They interviewed everyone who might have seen something useful. They looked for signs of arson, because fires this destructive were always suspicious, always raised the possibility of deliberate setting. The investigation focused initially on whether the fire might have been started by sparks from the gin machinery or by careless placement of a lantern, the kinds of accidental causes that sometimes led to plantation fires. But as they examined the remains more carefully, as they found evidence of multiple points of origin and traces of accelerant, as they reconstructed what must have happened, it became clear that this fire had been deliberately set. The realization that this was arson shifted the investigation in a predictable direction. In 1836 Georgia, when a plantation fire was determined to be arson, suspicion immediately fell on the enslaved population. Enslaved people had obvious motives to sabotage plantations. They had access to buildings and materials. And arson was one of the few forms of resistance available to people who were powerless in every other way. A method that did not require weapons or physical confrontation, but that could cause enormous damage if executed properly. The sheriff and Colonel Ashford began interrogations. They questioned enslaved people separately and in groups. They asked who had been where during the night of the fire. They looked for anyone who seemed nervous or evasive. They threatened punishment for anyone who was hiding information. And they paid particular attention to anyone who had recently experienced conflict with overseers or with plantation management. This last focus should have made Samuel an obvious suspect. His confrontation with Crawford over his mother's treatment had been witnessed by several people. His mother's death just weeks earlier gave him clear motive, and he had access to the materials needed to start a fire through his work in the carpenter shop. But several factors protected Samuel from immediate suspicion. First, he was 16 years old, and the investigators had difficulty imagining that someone so young could plan and execute something so destructive. Second, his father Joseph was a valued, skilled worker who had never caused any trouble, and the assumption was that Joseph's son would follow his example of careful compliance. Third, Samuel had been observed working hard in the bucket lines fighting the fire, which seemed inconsistent with being the person who had started it. And finally, there were other people on the plantation who had more obvious recent conflicts with management, and who, therefore, drew more initial scrutiny. Over the following week, 3 enslaved men were arrested on suspicion of arson. They were men who had been punished recently for various infractions, who had expressed anger about their treatment, who seemed like plausible suspects based on the logic that whoever had the most visible grievances must be responsible. These men were interrogated harshly. They were beaten. They were threatened with sale or execution, and they were held in chains while the investigation continued. But none of them had actually set the fire, and eventually, even under torture, they could provide no evidence that they had been involved, because there was no evidence to provide. The investigation stalled. The 3 men were eventually released, though, with warnings that they remained under suspicion and would be watched. Samuel observed all this with careful neutrality. He expressed the same shock and concern that everyone else displayed. He worked diligently at helping rebuild structures that had been damaged. He gave investigators no reason to look at him more closely. But inside, he was processing what he had done and what it meant. He had succeeded in causing enormous damage to the plantation. He had cost Colonel Ashford thousands of dollars. He had disrupted the operation that had killed his mother. But the system had not collapsed. Ashford was rebuilding. The plantation would continue. And 3 innocent people had been arrested and tortured because of something Samuel had done. This last fact troubled him more than he had anticipated. He had not thought carefully about who might be blamed for his action. He had been focused on the act itself and on the damage it would cause. Now he understood that resistance did not occur in isolation, that the consequences of individual actions spread through communities in ways that could not be fully predicted or controlled. But the fire had also shown Samuel something important. It had shown that the plantation was vulnerable. It had shown that one person acting alone with determination and basic materials could inflict serious harm on the system. And it had shown that if the system could be hurt financially, if the economic calculations that made slavery profitable could be disrupted, then perhaps slavery itself could eventually be undermined. This was a larger understanding than Samuel had words for at 16, but he felt it intuitively. The planters had power because they had wealth. Wealth came from cotton. Cotton came from enslaved labor working in facilities and using equipment that could be destroyed. If enough people destroyed enough facilities, if the cost of slavery became higher than its profits, the system would eventually become unsustainable. This thought led Samuel to a second action that was even more audacious than the first. The gin house had been destroyed, but could be rebuilt. Colonel Ashford had insurance that would partially cover the loss. The cotton that had burned was a single year's harvest and could be replaced next season. To truly cripple the plantation, to do damage that could not be easily repaired, Samuel would need to destroy something more fundamental. He would need to destroy the main house itself, the symbol of Ashford's wealth and status, the structure that represented everything the plantation existed to support. If the main house burned, the financial and psychological impact would be far greater than the loss of the gin house. It would send a message that nowhere was safe, that not even the planter's own home was beyond the reach of enslaved. People's rage. Samuel began planning the second fire in October. He knew this would be far more dangerous than the first. The main house was closer to where people lived. It was watched more carefully. And burning the residence of a white family was a crime that would trigger massive retaliation. That would lead to investigations far more intense than what had followed the gin house fire. That would likely result in multiple enslaved people being executed, whether they were actually guilty or not, as a demonstration of power and a deterrent to others who might consider similar actions. But Samuel had reached a point where consequences for himself and for others no longer weighed heavily enough to stop him. His mother was dead. His family was destroyed. His father had retreated into numb compliance. And Samuel had discovered something about himself. He had discovered that he would rather die fighting than live accepting. That existence without resistance was not truly living. That some things were worth any price. That the opportunity came on November 3rd. Colonel Ashford was traveling to Savannah for business that would keep him away for several days. His wife and children had accompanied him, making it a rare family trip. The main house was empty, except for 2 enslaved house servants who lived there, an elderly woman named Martha and a young girl named Ruth. Regular patrols continued, but the absence of the Ashford family meant that attention was focused more on the work, buildings, and less on the main house itself. Samuel identified this absence as his chance. The house being empty meant fewer people would be at risk. The servants could be warned to leave before the fire spread, and the symbolic impact of burning the planter's house while he was away would be even stronger than if Ashford had been present. On the night of November 3rd, Samuel made his preparations similar to the first fire, but adapted for the different target. He gathered materials from the carpenter's shop that was still partially operational. He waited until after midnight, and then he approached the main house using the darkness and his knowledge of the plantation grounds to avoid being seen. He had expected that entering the house would be difficult, that he would need to break a window or force a door. But he found that one of the ground floor windows had been left unlatched, a careless oversight by the servants or by the Ashford family before they departed. Samuel slipped inside the house and found himself in a world he had seen only briefly before during rare occasions. When his father had been called to repair something inside, the interior of the main house was furnished with an elegance that contrasted sharply with the bare functionality of the slave quarters. Carpets on the floors, paintings on the walls, furniture that was comfortable rather than merely adequate, books in shelves, crystal in cabinets, all the markers of wealth and refinement that cotton money purchased. Samuel moved through these rooms with purpose. He was not there to steal or to explore. He was there to destroy. He placed his incendiary materials carefully. Oil-soaked cloth under curtains that would catch fire easily. Turpentine poured on upholstered furniture. Wood shavings arranged to carry fire from room to room. He worked in darkness, relying on touch and memory of the house's layout, moving quietly to avoid waking the servants who were sleeping on the upper floor. When everything was prepared, Samuel paused for just a moment. He stood in Colonel Ashford's study, surrounded by the books and papers that represented the man's intellectual life, the life that was possible because other people worked themselves to death to fund it. Samuel thought about his mother, about watching her buried in an unmarked grave, about the casual cruelty that had killed her, about the fact that the man who owned this house and everything in it had never faced any consequences for his mother's death, and never would face consequences under the law. But consequences did not have to come from the law. Consequences could come from a 16-year-old boy with flint and steel and a determination that the powerful would not always act with impunity. Samuel lit the first fire. He lit multiple fires in different rooms, and then he went upstairs and woke the servants. He told Martha and Ruth that they needed to leave immediately, that the house was on fire, that they should run to the quarters and raise the alarm, but that they should not try to fight the fire because it was already beyond fighting. The elderly woman and the young girl stared at Samuel in shock, beginning to understand what had happened and who had made it happen. Martha started to speak, to ask questions or to protest, but Samuel interrupted her. He told them to go now if they wanted to live, that he would make sure they had time to get clear before the fire spread to where they were. They went, they fled down the stairs and out of the house, and Samuel followed after giving the fires a few more minutes to establish themselves. By the time Samuel reached the slave quarters, the main house was visibly burning. Flames showed in the lower floor windows. Smoke was beginning to pour from under the eaves. Martha and Ruth had raised the alarm. People were emerging from their cabins in confusion and fear, seeing the main house burning and not understanding how this could have happened again, not understanding what this meant. Samuel joined the crowd. He watched the house burn. He made no attempt to join any firefighting efforts because there were none. Everyone understood immediately that the main house was lost. The construction was too elaborate, too full of wood and fabric and other flammable materials. By the time enough water could be brought to make any difference, the fire would have consumed everything worth saving. The main house burned through the night. It burned completely and collapsed into its foundation, leaving only chimneys standing among the ruins. The financial loss was catastrophic. The house itself represented an investment of over $8,000. The furnishings and personal property inside added thousands more. And beyond the monetary loss, there was the symbolic devastation of seeing the center of the plantation's social life destroyed, of losing all the documents and personal items that connected the Ashford family to their history and identity. When Colonel Ashford returned from Savannah 3 days later and saw what remained of his home, he was reported to have wept openly, not just from the immediate loss, but from the understanding that his plantation had been targeted, that someone among the people he owned hated him, enough to destroy everything he had built. The investigation into the second fire was far more intense than the first. The sheriff brought in additional help. They questioned everyone on the plantation repeatedly. They used torture on people they suspected. They offered rewards for information. And they made clear that if the arsonist was not identified and delivered to them, the entire enslaved population would suffer collective punishment. But again, no one could provide information because no one except Samuel knew who had set the fires. Martha and Ruth knew that Samuel had been in the house, that he had warned them to leave. But they also understood that revealing this information would lead to Samuel's certain execution and would likely lead to their own punishment for not stopping him. They stayed silent. Everyone stayed silent, not because they approved of what Samuel had done, not because they all agreed with his methods, but because the alternative to silence was cooperating with the investigation, which would mean helping the system that oppressed them all. The silence infuriated the white community. The fact that 2 major fires could occur on the same plantation within 6 weeks and no one would provide information suggested to them a level of coordination and conspiracy that was terrifying. The fear that this aroused in Georgia's planter class was profound. If enslaved people could organize to this degree, if they could keep secrets this well, if they could strike with this kind of precision, then the entire system was more vulnerable than anyone had wanted to believe. Patrols were increased throughout the county. Laws were tightened around enslaved people's movements. Punishments for any infractions became more severe. The collective paranoia of the slaveholding class manifested in increased violence and control, but no amount of investigation produced the arsonist. Samuel had been too careful. He had acted alone, which meant there was no conspiracy to uncover. He had used materials that were common and accessible, which meant there was no unusual procurement to trace. He had been seen by the crowd after both fires, which established alibis of sorts. And he had the protective coloration of being young and being the son of a trusted, skilled worker. Eventually, the investigations wound down without resolution. The plantation and the county accepted that they would never know for certain who had set the fires, though suspicion remained diffused across the entire enslaved population, which was perhaps exactly the outcome that Samuel had wanted. Let them fear everyone. Let them understand that any enslaved person might be the next to strike. Let them lose sleep, wondering which of the people working their fields might be planning their destruction. Samuel's own family had mixed reactions to what had happened. His father Joseph suspected the truth, though Samuel never confirmed it. Joseph's response was complicated. On one hand, he was terrified for his son, terrified that Samuel would be discovered and killed, terrified that the family would lose another member to the violence of slavery. On the other hand, Joseph felt something that might have been pride or might have been vicarious satisfaction at seeing the plantation damaged, at seeing the wealth built on enslaved labor go up in smoke. He said nothing to Samuel directly, but the relationship between father and son changed, became more distant as Joseph struggled with his fear and his conflicted feelings about resistance versus survival. Grace and patience understood what Samuel had done. They understood it without being told, reading the truth in their brother's face and in his silence. Their response was grief. Grief for their mother. Grief for what the family had become. Grief for Samuel, who had transformed from their brother into something else, something harder and more dangerous. They were afraid of him now, not because they thought he would hurt them, but because they understood that he had crossed a boundary that most people never cross, that he had become capable of actions that exceeded normal human restraints, that grief and rage had made him into a weapon, and that weapons were dangerous to everyone, including those who wielded them and those who stood close to them, the broader enslaved. Community at Riverbend had varied reactions. Some people were inspired by what had happened, took secret satisfaction in seeing the plantation damaged, whispered to each other that someone had finally struck back and had struck back hard. Others were terrified of the increased surveillance and punishment that the fires had triggered, angry that someone's actions had made life more difficult for everyone, frustrated that individual resistance had brought collective suffering. And some people were simply confused, unable to understand why anyone would take such enormous risks for revenge that could not bring back the dead, and that might ultimately make things worse rather than better. What no one could dispute was that Samuel had accomplished something extraordinary. He had, at 16 years old, inflicted more damage on a Georgia plantation than most enslaved people managed in entire lifetimes. He had cost Colonel Ashford over $15,000 in direct losses, and probably far more in lost productivity and in the costs of increased security. He had demonstrated that plantations were vulnerable, that enslaved people were not powerless, that resistance was possible even for individuals acting alone. And he had avenged his mother in the most direct way available to him, by hurting the people responsible for her death in ways that they felt deeply. But Samuel also understood that his time at Riverbend was limited. The investigation had not identified him, but suspicion lingered. He was watched more carefully now, and eventually, either through his own misstep or through someone's betrayal or through simple bad luck, the truth would emerge, and when it did, he would be executed. The only real option left to him was escape. He needed to run before he was caught. He needed to disappear into the broader world and hope that he could survive as a fugitive. The alternative was staying at Riverbend and waiting for discovery and death dot in early December 1836. Samuel made his escape. He chose his moment carefully, waiting for a Sunday afternoon when supervision was minimal. He carried almost nothing, just a small bundle of food and one of his father's tools, a knife that could serve multiple purposes. He told his father he was leaving. Joseph tried to convince him to stay, argued that running would only confirm suspicions and would bring punishment on the family. But Samuel would not be dissuaded. He told his father that staying meant death either fast through execution or slow through the grinding violence of slavery, and that he preferred to die free in the attempt to reach freedom than to die enslaved, waiting for the system to finish, killing him the way it had killed his mother. The goodbye with his sisters was brief and painful. Grace and patience clung to him, begging him not to go, terrified that they would never see him again. Samuel promised he would find a way to come back for them someday, though he knew this was likely a lie, knew that escaped slaves almost never made it back to rescue family members, that the distances and the dangers were too great. But he told them the lie anyway, because they needed to hear it, and because he needed to believe for just a moment that reunion was possible. Samuel walked away from Riverbend on December 10th, 1836. He walked north because north meant further from the deep. South's plantation concentration meant getting closer to free states, even though those states were hundreds of miles away, and the journey would be extraordinarily dangerous. He traveled at night and hid during the day. He avoided roads and moved through forests and along waterways where tracking would be difficult. He stole food when he needed to and went hungry when stealing was too risky. He was pursued, hunted by slave catchers with dogs who worked for Colonel Ashford. But the pursuit eventually lost his trail in the complexity of Georgia's backcountry. And after several weeks, the active hunting stopped because the economic calculation shifted and the cost of continuing the search exceeded the value of recovering one enslaved teenager. The historical record loses Samuel after his escape. He appears in no census, no property records, no documentation that would allow his life to be traced beyond December 1836. This disappearance is itself significant. It suggests that Samuel succeeded in escaping the South, that he reached Northern Territory where he could live as a free person, even if that freedom came with constant fear of recapture. Or it suggests that he died in the attempt, succumbed to exposure or violence or accident in the dangerous journey north, died free, even if that freedom lasted only days or weeks. Either way, Samuel vanished from the documented world in the way that successful fugitives needed to vanish, erasing themselves completely to avoid being traced and dragged back into bondage. Subscribe to Crypt Liturgy and turn on all notifications so you never miss another powerful history that the world tried to erase. Remember that the past speaks to us through stories like Samuel's.